It looks like it's 12 o'clock. Welcome, everyone. This program is being recorded. My name is Amy Coates-Madsen, and I'm so pleased to have the chance to talk with all of you today. Even before the current crisis, remote work was becoming more and more popular among nonprofit organizations and organizations of all types. With the onset of the current pandemic, many organizations have moved all or most of their workforce to 100% remote work arrangements, virtually overnight. However, many organizations could use a leg up when it comes to planning their remote work policy, planning out how this will work for their organization. This workshop will focus on things like creating an appropriate and effective remote work policies. We'll talk about the benefits and drawbacks. We'll talk about the benefits and the challenges and how we can begin to address these things. We hope that you'll leave with some good tools and materials that will be helpful for you and some ideas that will help your organization move from maybe where you are right at this moment to maybe an even more robust remote work environment. The main handout or learning tool that we have for this program is called A Charitable Nonprofits Guide to Remote Work, created by Maryland Nonprofits and our Standards for Excellence Institute. And this tool is available currently free of charge through the Maryland Nonprofits website on our COVID-19 page under business functions. So it is my pleasure today to be co-presenting with my good colleague, Patty Morton. And I'll let Patty let you introduce yourself.
Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you, Amy. It really is a pleasure to be here with you today, talking to our friends and members about remote work, something that's on everyone's mind today. So I'm Patty Morton. I'm General Counsel at Maryland Nonprofits, and I thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Patty. And I serve as the Director of Programs at Maryland Nonprofits and work in a variety of different areas of the association, and thought that it might be great to start with just a little bit of background. Maryland Nonprofits works to strengthen organizations and networks for greater quality of life and equity. We have members all around the entire state of Maryland, and we have efforts in many different program areas. We provide, have a significant presence in Annapolis and do advocacy work on behalf of the nonprofit sector. We have a terrific consulting practice that can help your organization in a number of different ways, one-on-one. We include, as part of the Maryland Nonprofits family, MARFI, Maryland Association of Resources for Families and Youth. We also offer the Nonprofit Development Center program in partnership with the Maryland Department of Commerce for nonprofits that are less than 10 years old and have budgets of under $750,000. And we offer the Standards for Excellence program as well. And the Standards for Excellence program focuses on best practices in nonprofit governance and management. And we provide all kinds of education to help organizations meet these standards, as well as an accreditation and recognition program. And I see some attendees in our group today are from organizations that are Standards for Excellence seal holders. And so with that, I definitely encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter, to join Maryland Nonprofits if you haven't already done so, and certainly to be aware of and to check out our COVID-19 page on the Maryland Nonprofits website. This site is updated multiple times a week and many days, multiple times a day or an hour. We're trying to make sure that our nonprofits have all the best resources possible to navigate in these tough times. Someone sent a note to me earlier saying, this is different than a Zoom call that I've been involved with before. Are all the participants muted? And yes, this Zoom call is being conducted in a webinar format, which has each individual coming onto the call in a muted format. And we'll ask you to send your questions through the question and answer field and also through the chat. And we'll also have some engagement through a poll. And there is also a function, if you look at the participants tab, for you to raise your hand. And when you raise your hand, we can call on you to talk or ask a question or provide insight. So hopefully that will work well as we go through this afternoon. So our agenda today, we have quite a few things we'd like to address, including we'll talk about the definition and scope of remote work. We'll talk about some common misperceptions. We'll talk about benefits, challenges, and concerns. Talk a little bit about eligibility, the roles and responsibilities of both the employer and the employee. We'll talk about some special circumstances, and of course we're all living in the midst of a special circumstance right now. We'll talk about the legal implications, some practical tips and hacks, and we'll take your questions and answers. And certainly throughout our time together, if you'd like to send your questions through the chat or through question and answer, that would be terrific as well. I think we'll sort of be opening up for folks to raise their hands and ask those questions verbally at the end. All right, so let's talk a little bit about who is in our virtual meeting room today. And I've got a little poll that I'm going to launch with a couple of questions just so we can get an idea of who's in the room. So there's a couple questions. I'm going to ask you to answer the questions on the screen, and then we'll close the poll and we'll have a chance to see who's in the room. Can you see the poll? Great, thanks for filling out these questions, perfect. Give you about 20 more seconds, so go ahead and answer those questions. Oh gosh, I got a note saying that the submit button does not work. Okay. Maybe try to click again and see if that works, please. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll and show you the results. Okay, so how many staff do your organization have? We've got a third of our participants today having less than 10 staff, about a quarter have 11 to 20, 16% in the 21 to 50, 16% over 100, less than 250, and small sliver, about 4%, between 250 and 500. Okay, so we've got a mix of folks who have remote work policies at this point. And then look at that, 96% have moved to nearly no remote work to nearly all remote work in the last few weeks. Policies in place. Have you experienced any challenges? 70% have experienced some challenges. So you're in the right place. Hopefully we'll be able to walk through some solutions for your work. I'm going to close out the survey. We'll move on to the next. So we'd like to talk just a little bit about defining remote work. And we've at Maryland Nonprofits have been offering assistance around remote work for a number of years. And in fact, we just updated our remote work materials last fall. And we even changed the terminology. And initially we were using the term telework or telecommuting, but the term remote work is more the current version, though we will likely will be using those terms interchangeably today. So certainly a big part of the definition is that in remote work, you're eliminating a commute to a central place of work. Hopefully an arrangement between the employer and the employee that outlines the specifics of the work schedule, work days, or assignments done in a way that is done remotely. Okay. When we look at remote work, we look at a couple different dimensions. And I think there's 4 that I think are the most key to our work. Certainly, first there's the location. And need to determine what location that might be. 2 months ago, we might have said that work location could be your home, your public library, your coffee shop, a local restaurant. Today, we're oftentimes seeing that location is really the home site. Then we look at the use of and technology to do our work. What kind of technology exists and what kind of technology do you need to do your work remotely? What's the time distribution? And this can be looked at in one of 2 ways. You can look at time distribution in terms of how many days a week you'll be working remotely versus how many days a week you'll be working in the office. And then we also know that in some ways, some time distribution looks at whether people will be working a standard 9-to-5 type situation or if there's some alternative that will be employed. And then there's also another key important dimension is the relationship between the employer and the employee. That's always a relationship, but in the midst of remote work, there's some special considerations. Now we know that there's different types of remote workers and different types of remote work settings as well. Some folks are working full-time remote. Some are more occasional, though it could be on a regular basis, maybe regularly working 1 or 2 days a week remotely. You might see folks who are working ad hoc remote. And like, for instance, maybe they work in development and 10 different days of the year, they are working remotely because they're on site at a fundraising event or something to that effect. And then, of course, with this whole new category of remote workers who have joined the ranks of the remote workforce without a lot of plans and structures in place in the midst of the current pandemic. And also there's traditionally this idea that how do remote workers interact with their colleagues, some of which may also be working remotely or some of which may be working on site or at a physical office location. There are a lot of different statistics on remote work, and they vary quite widely, actually. These statistics are from flexjobs.com, and they stated that in the last 10 years, the amount of remote workers grew by 91% across all markets, which is pretty amazing, and that there were 4.7 million in 2020 prior to the beginning of March. Now, of course, in the midst of the current situation, in the midst of the pandemic, we may be handling the dimension of work, those 4 dimensions, in a different way. So many nonprofits maybe said, we could do remote work. Our staff have laptops. Well, that's one piece of it, but really that's just one piece, of course. So not only do folks maybe need to have access to laptops, but maybe other types of technology as well. Some staff may also need to have webcams if they're not part of their laptops. They may need to have special microphones. They may need to have other types of specialized equipment to do their work. In terms of time distribution, that's another piece. In the midst of COVID-19, lots of times we're seeing that entire organizations are moving all of their staff to a remote work environment, and where in a more traditional type of remote work environment, the employers may have stated that time distribution is the exact same hours they would have worked if they were in the office. In the midst of COVID-19, that time distribution may be flexed a bit depending on the responsibilities of the employees and what they're doing. And then in terms of the relationship between the employer and employee, that may also be adjusted a bit in the midst of COVID-19. Like, for instance, I'll just give you a little bit of background at Maryland Nonprofits. we had a pretty smooth transition, I think, to everyone working remote. Most of our staff had a laptop they used as their regular computer, and everyone had access to a laptop. So that was terrific. Not everyone had maybe the best webcam per se, but we all had that opportunity to have a laptop, which is great. Most folks were able to stay with their regular work schedule. There are a few people who had to get special permission to work at sort of an alternative work schedule, and I'm one of those. I have 3 small children at my home, and so I kind of do a little bit of extra early morning hours before my house gets loud, and kind of arrange my days in a little bit of a unique circumstance to make sure that I can handle all the responsibilities. The relationships between the employer and the employee at our organization have changed just a bit in terms of some added flexibility, some added communication and check-in opportunities, and also some added reimbursement for some things that we have not been reimbursing in sort of traditional remote work situations. We can talk about that a little bit later. Patty?
Thanks, Amy. So as we sit here thinking about and talking about remote work, I'm sure that it seems like a long time ago when this was an idea that we were just discussing. Before the pandemic, many employers considered remote work with some trepidation. They had some misconceptions about what that remote work might mean. So what might some of those misconceptions have been that kept them from embracing a remote work model? Next slide. Thank you. So employers are reluctant to allow remote work because they're fearful that remote workers won't be effective. They won't do enough. They might not be motivated in their homes. There may be decreased productivity. Meetings maybe they think would be ineffective because it's difficult over the phone or over Zoom to have a meeting that's as good as an in-person meeting. We all know that. Communications can suffer. And also there is this fear that culture can be eroded. So when employers are considering face-to-face interaction and worried that they won't be able to provide feedback or orient new projects, one thing they overlook is that they are in control of the remote work relationship. So the truth is that employers can dictate the number of hours and days that an employee can remote work. On average, a typical remote worker works about 18.6 hours a week remotely, or 2.4 days a week remotely. That's pre-COVID-19. Employers sometimes feel that employees might seek a remote working schedule as a replacement for dependent or elder care. We all know that remote working policies should stipulate that inherent in the definition of remote work, employees are supposed to be concentrating on their business-related materials while they are working. Employees are not permitted to work simultaneous to caring for children or elder family members or other persons in the home. Work is work. Also, once a policy exists, employers really need to offer the opportunity for work from home to all employees. However, the organization has the responsibility to dictate the specifics of the policy. Not everyone can remote work, and it's up to the employer to create criteria for eligibility. Those criteria could include, among other things, potential for remote work jobs or different performance levels, different kind of tasks that lend themselves to remote work. Next slide. Thanks. So in the midst of the current pandemic, some of those regular features of remote work and some of the common protocols that are in place for remote work really might not be practical, and they require some additional flexibility and patience on everyone's part, really, the employer and the employee. For instance, some remote workers who normally work a full-time might need to work less than full-time in a remote setting. In fact, some full-time workers who normally work the 9-to-5 day right now might request an alternative or more flexible schedule for some of the reasons that Amy was just describing. They have other compelling commitments and responsibilities that need to be seen to during those hours. So in today's context, many remote workers will need to juggle care for others with their remote work in a manner that is a little bit different from the traditional remote work arrangement. Typically, remote work policies require certain characteristics of the work and the work from home, workstation work areas, but today, in the midst of everyone working at home and staying at home, those requirements may need to be a little bit more flexible as well. Next slide. So what are some of the potential benefits and concerns that both employers and employees have? As we are all staying at home now, we have to explore the advantages and disadvantages of remote working. Everyone involved has to understand and predict the impact that the agreement will have on productivity of both the employer or the employee and the organization. Next slide. Thanks. So when we think about what the employer benefits may include, there are a number of things that a well-constructed remote working policy can help employers accomplish. First of all, you can attract and retain talent. Our most important asset is our human resource, and if you have a good policy and a practice of engaging that policy, you will earn the trust of your human resources by being a credible provider of remote work experience. Also, employers can economize on space and reduce real estate costs. So it isn't necessarily the case that everyone needs to work in an office, and particularly now that we are working from home, we see how in some ways it really can increase productivity and be beneficial. So moving forward, employers may consider economizing on the space that they rent. Remote working can also decrease absenteeism. Remote workers frequently take fewer sick days. So according to the FlexJobs survey that we've referenced, about 50% of remote workers said remote working reduced their use of sick leave, and 56% said it reduced absenteeism. So this is really a great benefit for employers. It also can increase employee productivity. Certain employees function better without the daily distractions of the office, without the phone ringing, without folks stopping by their office. According to one survey that we evaluated, 65% of respondents said they were more productive in their remote jobs than in their office. That's a tremendous benefit. Also, it can possibly improve relations between supervisors and employees because the practice of remote working requires consistent communication and mutual trust. Remote working can actually strengthen the supervisor-employee relationship. The FlexJobs study also indicated that 50% of those asked said it reduced their stress level to work remotely, and 80% of respondents said that their stress level was non-existent to moderate in a remote working environment. Next slide. Thank you. So what are the employee benefits to a remote work situation? Those benefits include a much more manageable structure to your day. If you eliminate a commute, then you have more time for either work or responsibilities at home. It also eliminates the expenses related to your commute. I filled my gas tank about 6 weeks ago, and the needle really hasn't moved. That is one tiny little silver lining that we're all experiencing. Another benefit to employees is the increased flexibility in completing projects. So we have our work to do, we're in our home, we have all of the hours of the day, and it might work better for some employees to be able to attend to responsibilities in the home and then back and forth with their work. Again, it reduces stress associated with the work environment. If you can control the environment in which you work, hopefully you can make it a more productive place for yourself. Also, it's a decreased workplace distraction. So for the employee, it is quite a benefit to be able to take a couple hours, a chunk of time, and really focus on a project to its completion. And many employees describe improved work-life balance with remote work. So next slide. Thank you. In the current environment, moving staff people to a work from home environment, social distancing is the obvious benefit. And it is required by law in many jurisdictions, including Maryland right now. Another benefit, remote work, even if it's an imperfect option, it does provide opportunity for organizations to continue to advance their mission-related work in the absence of the traditional office setting. So we're required by law now to stay at home, but that doesn't mean we have to stop in our tracks. We can still pursue the important work that we do. And as we're all balancing responsibilities of work and home, we really need to acknowledge that remote work allows employees to provide some of the coverage for children and elder care that needs to be taken care of. Thanks, Amy. Next slide. So it bears mentioning that your employees are your employees, whether they are in the main office or working remotely in a remote work arrangement. So assuming they're still on your payroll, now working remotely, we cannot assume that they will always be working. Our remote workers are equally eligible for the relief provided by the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which was passed by Congress and signed into law in mid-March. So even if we have the remote work plans all set up and we're expecting our employees to be working remotely, as nonprofit employers, we need to be sure that we're complying with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. Just briefly, what that means is, if necessary, employers have to provide 2 weeks of paid sick time at the regular rate of pay if the employee is sick with COVID-19, is quarantined, or is experiencing symptoms of COVID-19, or 2 weeks of paid sick time at 2/3 rate of pay if that employee is caring for a family member who is sick with or quarantined with COVID-19, or a child whose school or childcare is closed due to COVID-19. Additionally, employers have to provide an additional 10 weeks of paid family leave at 2/3 the rate of pay for a parent to care for a child whose school or childcare is closed for reasons related to COVID-19. You can see that both the sick time and the family leave are capped. Sick time at $511 per day for a maximum of 10 days for care of self, or $200 a day with a $10,000 per quarter maximum for caring for dependents. We're not going to dive really deep into the FFCRA today, but it's worth mentioning that the law applies even for remote workers. Next slide. What are some employer concerns? Naturally, employers are concerned about information security. It can become difficult for employers to guarantee the confidentiality of certain information when employees work on sensitive materials outside of the workplace. Lack of oversight. It can be difficult to remotely assess the productivity of remote workers, especially of those whose work can't be measured quantitatively. And of course, legal concerns. Employers have to evaluate whether there are local zoning laws, federal workplace regulations, or if there are considerations of employer liability that need to be addressed. Next slide. Some employee drawbacks could potentially include diminished interpersonal relations. Fewer hours in the office means fewer hours spent conversing and interacting with supervisors and coworkers. I am sure that many of you have experienced that real craving for just a conversation with a colleague. I know that I do. Frequently we'll walk down the hall and speak with Amy or Henry or any of our colleagues about something I'm thinking about and working on. And in today's setting, it is not the same to be on a Zoom or telephone call. So remote work distractions, this is possibly true for many of us that there are distractions in the home that don't exist at the workplace. They could include children, put under other circumstances, visitors, not now, household chores, a television, other things that can limit the employee's focus on work-related tasks. Ideally, your remote work area is separated from such distractions, but that's not achievable for all of us. There is also this question of double taxation. So income taxes may be dependent on where an employee remote works and the location of the central workplace. If you work in Pennsylvania and live in Maryland or vice versa, it's possible that you could be taxed in both jurisdictions. Next slide. Amy, back to you.
Thanks. Thank you. So we'll talk a little bit about criteria for eligibility, and we'll talk first about that criteria in sort of generally in sort of normal times. And we want to also focus on the idea that, of course, some positions are not necessarily suitable for remote work. Certain jobs require face-to-face interaction or direct service to individuals. So there are, certain positions that may not easily be something that can be done remotely. Of course, we know a lot of nonprofits are in the essential work category. You may be providing residential services or health services or any number of different types of services, and many of your employees may not be in a position to be in remote work positions. So the organization, as Patty mentioned before, needs to develop a criteria for figuring out what positions are suitable for remote work and be able to look at that over regular intervals. So generally, we tend to think about remote work positions as one where few or 0 hours are needed at a central workplace. And sometimes this, opens up the opportunity to hire someone who may not live in your community or even your state to do the work of your organization. How can communications be done in that particular position? Can communications be accomplished in a remote way using different technology? That's another kind of criteria. Can the assignments and the services offered be conducted and completed in a remote way as well? If the position requires specialized equipment that is, on site at the central workplace, then that particular position might not be qualify. Other types of essential direct service work may also be in that same boat. Eligible positions might include employees that, attend different meetings and conferences, providing administrative or technical support to other individuals who are doing writing, research, and things that can be conducted using the types of technology that we have available at this time. We also look at, while each position you need to look at whether each position is eligible for remote work, also looking at employees and looking at employees. Some organizations have a tenure criteria in place. You need to be on staff for 6 months before you can have a remote work situation extended to you, although I think we're seeing that less and less. And certainly in the midst of our current times, any sort of tenure pieces have been made a lot more flexible. Having the appropriate place to do remote work and the schedule that would allow it, and being able to provide excellent service. An employee review or supervisor must indicate in many cases that the employee has performed at an average or above average situation, potentially to be permitted to do remote work sort of in general times. And then when we look at sort of the current situation, we maybe can boil it down to a single question, can the employee's work be completed in a remote work framework? And we're looking really just at that question. Can it be done in a remote way? If so, let's figure out how to do it. And then to figure out if the employee has the ability to work remote, can the organization provide the resources that employees need to do remote work? You know, is there reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses? These are the kinds of things that we've been considering. What computer equipment is required? Do you need to access additional computer equipment than what is currently available? And then, you know, what kind of technology solutions can your organization access for encouraging the team-like atmosphere that you may need in order to accomplish your important mission? But really looking at, can this work be completed in a remote way? So then we look at some of the roles and responsibilities of employers and employees in the midst of remote work. Each group needs to be aware of their own roles and responsibilities, and some of the guidelines that we'll talk about, I think, will help maximize your productivity in terms of how the terms of the employment are upheld. So the employer, you know, still needs to be concerned with annual evaluation and ongoing feedback. This should be provided in a timely manner. You should also ensure that the work location is a safe location and meets those safety requirements. In a general remote work situation, employees might be asked to fill out a checklist where they describe their work location and the safety factors that they have in place to make it a safe place to work. The employer should provide the necessary equipment that requires employees, or they can, or that require the employees to have the necessary equipment or technology. The organization also needs to provide the support. We work with an outsourced IT firm, and I was talking to some of their staff in the week where, you know, everyone moved from being in the office to being remote. And I said, I bet your life is pretty busy right now. And they said, yeah, you wouldn't believe how busy our life is right now because we have so many of their clients were moving to a remote work situation. Then I think the employer needs to think about what kinds of reimbursement will be provided. And I see there was a question on that. What are generally the out-of-pocket expenses incurred for remote work? And so that generally the kind of expenses that might be required are things like high-speed internet, maybe mobile phone service. There may even be some out-of-pocket expenses for things like office supplies or equipment. So things like that. And so we think about what types of reimbursement might be offered, and what might be offered in sort of normal times might actually be different than what's offered in the midst of the pandemic. And we'll talk about that in a bit as well. And then also when someone is no longer going to be working for the organization, that employer would need to provide employees with notification if they're terminated or if the telecommuting or remote work contract is completed. Okay, Patty, thank you for that response. And then we think about the employee's responsibilities. I mentioned before having a remote work or telecommuting checklist. The employee needs to adhere to their work schedule. What is the work schedule that you will be adhering to? And there may even be some certain items like, you know, employees, when they are working, they're expected to check their voicemail a certain number of times per day or per hour or something like that. And certainly also encouraging levels of flexibility that are appropriate. The employees need to be communicating with their team members and with their organization on a fairly frequent basis. And that would be potentially defined by the employer and the team that the individual is working on. During remote work, we want to see performance at an average or above average level, of course. Employees are often asked to sign in that in an a remote work agreement that they're going to keep their work materials in a safe and secure location, that they would be taking care of the organization's laptop, of any equipment, and any confidential information in a way that is appropriate given the organization's mission and the individuals that are served. Certainly, the terms and conditions of employment would also be continue with a remote work situation. And so that would include things like if the employee is an hourly employee and they need permission to do overtime, like those things would continue even in the midst of remote work. And if the employee were to terminate their employment, decide that they were going to seek other employment, they'd need to provide their employer with notice of that in the same way that they would provide notice if they were working in the office. So let's see, I'm going to turn it over to Patty now.
Thanks, Amy. So at the heart of the agreement, at the heart of the relationship is your written agreement. And hopefully you can work out the details of the remote work agreement agreeably in a collaborative way with your remote workers. And what would you cover? So we have sample language in the Standards for Excellence Remote Work Agreement, which will be made available to you. And some of the things that you'll want to include, of course, include the schedule, your remote work days, and the home office or alternative location hours. So we talk in the model agreement about the opportunity to work remotely on the days and times that would be listed and agreed to between the employer and the employee. And the organization can revoke the privilege at any time. This would be in regular times, of course, and that employment at the organization is likely at will. So we require employees to sign and agree that they would bear all costs related to the establishment and maintenance of their home workstation or alternate work site, including, but not limited to, high-speed secure internet access, ensuring that their computer has antivirus protection, whether it's provided by the employer or the employee, and a printer if it's necessary for that worker to complete their work, and a phone, of course. So it's important to note that the laws of some states, like California and Illinois, might require reimbursement of expenses incurred for business purposes, including remote work setup expenses. You just need to check the state law where you are working to ensure that you can comply with those requirements. We also note in the agreement that the employee ensures that the house workstation is safe and secure and free from distraction, that they abide by all safety protocols set forth by the organization, and that they ensure that safe work conditions exist and that other policies of the employer are followed. We ask them to state that they know they have to allow an organizational representative to inspect the designated workplace at any time during regular working hours on a regularly scheduled work day, and that they will arrange for care by a third party for children or other household members who require supervision. Finally, we ask employees to agree that they'll be available by phone and email during the times agreed upon for remote work, and that they will comply with office policies about reporting time. A non-exempt employee who works remotely must also take and log required breaks and has to obtain pre-approval to work overtime in accordance with the employer's policies. Next slide. Additional sample language that we've taken from the Standards for Excellence Remote Work Agreement relates to, sorry, just catching up with you. the need to check phone and email messages regularly while working remotely, but no less frequently than every 2 hours, unless the employee is attending an offsite meeting on behalf of the organization or has prior approval from the supervisor. We ask them to agree that their work phone will be forwarded to their cell phone or other phone where they're available to answer it, either their home or cell, and that the employee will answer the phone in a professional manner as if he or she were in the office, ensuring that there isn't any background noise and that they wouldn't be distracted by the caller. We ask them to promise that if they're not able to answer the phone, their message will be professional and identify that who they are and that they work for Maryland nonprofits. So in the model agreement, we ask employees to agree that no third-party business meetings will occur at the remote work location of their home. All meetings will occur at the organization's office, the other party's office or location, or some other public location. We want to prevent professional meetings from occurring in our employees' homes. We ask employees to promptly return all organizational paper files taken home on remote work days and keep all confidential files in a secure location at the workstation while they are at home. Finally, we ask workers to agree that they'll follow all of the employer's policies, including the policies for preventing and reporting safety concerns or prohibited harassment. Employees agree that all of their employer's policies, including the policy on proper use of electronic communications to allow the employer to access their electronic communications, apply equally to work communications made from a home computer. And we have the employee date and sign, as well as the supervisor or CEO of the organization. Next slide. Thanks. To avoid some of the risks associated with telecommuting or remote working, organizations should also consider some additional components when developing the policy. You might think about using a trial period to assess whether the arrangement is suitable and conducive to efficiency. So maybe it's a week or 30 days or 6 months, but you should maintain or modify or discontinue the remote working arrangement at the end of that trial period based on how it went. You should also think about inspection of and insurance for the telecommute or remote work location. Employers should consider requiring that an inspection of the remote location be made, and should consider requiring employees to purchase or maintain insurance that would cover injuries related to remote work. That is optional. Under other circumstances, workers' comp would apply, and that all will be resolved in conversation with your remote worker. Employers also want to consider a procedure or a mechanism to monitor hours. Whether that's an online system or a paper tracking system, employees should be making sure that they know what hours they are actually spending on work when they are in their remote location. Okay, next slide. Back to you, Amy.
Great, thanks, Patty. On that last point, Patty, you had mentioned monitoring, how much time people are working, and I'd also offer that, sometimes organizations come up with a hammer for situations like that when, maybe a more gentle situation might be more appropriate. I was on a call recently where someone was talking about the idea that their staff members were required to be on Zoom all of the time that they were working, and that somebody was always able to kind of pop in and make sure that they were working at their desk. And in a lot of cases, that kind of situation could backfire, and I can imagine that would be really a challenge for me to want to be on Zoom constantly with the idea that someone might be kind of looking over my shoulder every moment. We think about those kinds of things as well. So
I'll just pop in and say there has to be some trust between the employer and the employee in these times and other times when there's a remote work relationship. You have to be able to assess that really everybody has good intentions and don't need to be looked at after every minute.
So let's talk about some special circumstances. There are some special circumstances where an employee may be eligible to remote work without strictly following the criteria that we've mentioned before. And these will depend upon the environment, the employee's needs, the organization's needs, many different items. And so first we'll just talk about some of those special circumstances. If the employee is on family and medical leave, and certain employers with over 50 employees are covered under the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993. But let's say you're in the midst of a 12-week family medical leave. Although the employer can't require that the employee work during this time, if the employee wishes to work during this time and have a remote work arrangement in place, that can happen. But the remote work that is completed and those hours can't be counted as leave taken. That would be time that the employee is working. Natural disasters and other times when it's unsafe to get to work, certainly those kinds of times there might be it's snowed 3 feet today, so it's not safe to come to the central location, but please work from home. So there might be a emergency remote work. Sometimes the employee has to do work that's offsite. Maybe they have to travel to another state to do their job. Maybe a part of their job is that they travel to different locations that the organization maintains. But remote work may be not only at someone's home, but it could be traveling, depending on the work that needs to be accomplished. And certainly we're in the midst of a global health pandemic. And in situations like that, of course, the physical offices may be closed altogether due to fears that the disease may be spread. And in those situations, as an employer, you're not in this essential category. You may have no option other than to really be exploring remote work and how it will work for your organization if you want your employees to be able to continue to work toward meeting your organization's mission in the midst of not being permitted on site. So certainly this current situation is one big special circumstance in and of itself. We have a lot of different things that we're facing. Additional needs from those that we serve cannot be underscored enough. Our employees and our leaders are facing the stress of the situation. Some of our employees and our team members are caring for others due to COVID-19 illness or exposure, where there's special circumstance that we've already mentioned, that there may be children or other dependents that are underfoot. There is no childcare available. There's no school available, no day programs available for individuals maybe with disabilities or older adults. So we're facing a lot of situations. So even if your organization has the very best remote work practices in place and you've got the best computer equipment and the best agreements, we know that in this current situation, your staff are in the midst of a really stressful situation. They may be caring for others who have had some exposure. They may be caring for those that need care right now. So this is a really special situation and unique. Patty, back to you.
Amy. We are in uncharted territory, and presently there are few laws that strictly define and regulate remote working policies, but employers and employees are in the moment and have to make arrangements to do this remote work. So best that we are all aware of some legal concerns associated with remote working so that we can anticipate problems and work around them. Next slide. Thanks, Amy. So what are some of the implications of remote work? Of course, you have federal and state employment laws. The employment of all employees, including remote workers, needs to comply with federal and state laws, including anti-discrimination laws. All employees have to be given the same consideration for remote working if their positions qualify. Employers are not allowed to offer or limit the option of remote work solely based on gender, race, nationality, age, and/or disability. That has never been more true than it is now, but even outside of pandemic times, that is true. State remote working laws. Some states may have telecommuting or remote working policies and guidelines in place. Some states like Virginia offer a corporate income tax credit for employers who allow their employees to telecommute. So they're in a pretty good posture right now. Income taxes. If an employee works remotely in a state different from the location of the central workplace, he or she might be subject to additional income taxes. Currently, there's no federal law dictating which income taxes an out-of-state employee has to pay. But most states, like Maryland, will not apply their own state income taxes to non-resident employees, giving that worker the benefit of only paying for one state's income tax. However, some states, such as New York, Pennsylvania, Nebraska, Delaware, and New Jersey, will tax wages and salaries of non-residents if telecommuting is performed out of convenience rather than necessity. So not during international global pandemic, but if under other circumstances you have remote working, that could be something out of preference or convenience, not necessity. So if an employee telecommutes in New Jersey and his or her workplace is in New York, that worker, not during pandemic times, but regularly, might be subjected to income taxes from both states. Unemployment benefits and workers' compensation. Employers and employees should be aware that some states have ruled remote workers are not eligible for unemployment benefits or workers' comp, where the employer is located in one state and the employee in another. Overtime policies. Remote working employees are subject to the same overtime policies as regular employees who work strictly at the central office. All applicable state and federal laws apply to telecommuters, and therefore the same standards regarding overtime wages and exempt versus non-exempt status should be regarded. Zoning laws. There may be local zoning laws that restrict the operation of business in homes, and this could possibly include remote work offices. An employee who seeks to telecommute or remote work should contact their local government jurisdiction about restrictions and potential exceptions to those laws. Tort liability. The employer might be responsible for injuries, theft, or loss incurred at a telecommuting location during or outside of scheduled work hours. In some cases, neither the employee's home insurance, their general liability homeowners, nor the employer's workplace insurance will cover damages within the telecommuting location. That is definitely something that you want to look into before it's too late. Confidential materials. All materials, files, and documents that an employee takes outside of the organization's home office space still remain the property of the organization, and the use of those materials should be kept secure. If you need to put it under lock and key or with secure passwords, that should be done at the remote work location. Also, any materials written or developed, received, or compiled during the performance of remote work are considered the intellectual property of the employing organization, and the use of those materials should follow company policy. Employers should ensure that employees' networks and devices are securely protected against viruses or other technology issues that could result in the loss or transfer of intellectual property. Privacy concerns. An employee who telecommutes still reserves his right to privacy, but employers do also have the right to conduct a search of company-owned devices like laptops or mobile phones in order to monitor their use. So consult your employer's or your organization's employee handbook about the ownership of material in case there may be exceptions to that rule. Finally, exposure of employees to pandemic. I would refer to the CDC, the Maryland Department of Health, and OSHA, who offer guidance on how to prepare workplaces for pandemic. Employers need to consider how to reduce the risk of exposures for public health and also to protect themselves against liability. Next. Yep.
Patty, can I jump here for
Please.
a moment?
Yeah, of course.
So we talk about privacy concerns, and the employer can, conduct a search of your laptop or search your emails or things like that. I understand that. But when it comes to things like monitoring your mobile device, if you've got a cell phone that's your personal cell phone that you happen to be using to do your remote work, can your employer search that?
I think that would depend on whether or not your employer is providing any kind of reimbursement for that cell phone. If it's a company-owned cell phone, then that property belongs to the company. If it is your personal device, I think there might be some question if the company is paying for the use of that device, whether or not they are entitled to look at it. But if it is your own cell phone and you're concerned about that in any way, it invites a conversation with your employer about a reasonable way for them to monitor and oversee work-related information versus your right to privacy on your own personal device.
Yeah, I would imagine I, like many employees, would want my private mobile device to be considered, continue to be private. I might have credit card information on that, photos, confidential information about my children.
I think the employer's right to monitor would be limited to anything related to work.
Right. And we also got a question in the chat in the last few minutes from B. Hargrove, who said, can employees be required to be visible during video calls, or is name visibility enough?
I don't think there's a law about requiring them to be visible, and I would encourage employers to be reasonable and flexible in this. If there's a reason that you need to see the employee, then I would explain that in advance to the employee and make sure that they have the ability, including an external camera for their computer, to facilitate that. But if there's no requirement, if there's no practical need for them to be visible, I would think carefully about making that requirement of them.
Great, thanks. We'll move on to the next slide then. Thanks, Patty.
Thank you. So we can't finish this conversation about remote work without at least talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. If remote working is offered to employees with disabilities, then the ADA requires that the employer guarantee that the remote worker location adequately accommodates the employee. So employers are not legally required by the ADA to offer remote work arrangements, but if they are offered, then the employer has to extend the offer of remote work to all employees, including employees with physical disabilities or any kind of disabilities who are eligible for remote work. What are reasonable accommodations? The ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations that allow a differently abled or disabled employee to remote work. So if a wheelchair-bound employee chooses to remote work from home, then the employer or the employee has to certify that there's entrance accessibility, like no steps or ramp access. Medical certification of the employee's ability to perform in remote work location may be required. So in some scenarios, a central workplace might be a more conducive work environment because of its amenities. Okay.
All right, well, let's turn a bit and talk about some practical tips. And we're going to sort of divide these practical tips into two parts. We're first going to talk about tips for nonprofit, then on the employer side, and then we'll talk about some tips on the employee side. And I'm also really hopeful that you can use the chat and jump in here with ideas and insights that you have found particularly helpful as you are making transitions and as you are right in the midst of remote work in your own organizations. So even if you're just starting in remote work, you're definitely encouraged to have remote work agreements in place. That document I mentioned at the very beginning of our time together, A Nonprofit's Guide to Remote Work, is available on that website. And for anyone who's registered for this class, you can also receive a copy of something that we have actually modified just in the last week, which is a remote work agreement that would be suitable during the pandemic. And we've made some modifications to the regular remote work agreement, and we'll be sending that out when we send out the slides for the session.
Do you want to switch to the next slide?
Oh, I do. Sorry.
Thanks.
Thanks. So we'd encourage you to have agreements in place, even if they are temporary agreements, right up front. So we want to think about that. I would also encourage you to have the employer to have a team strategy in place. How will you make sure that your team members continue to stay engaged in their work and with one another? This might be the time to have more meetings than maybe you did prior to the situation where everyone was from home, because you're missing out on those opportunities to run into each other in the hallways or knocking on each other's doors. You may end up with more team meetings. You're meeting more frequently, maybe for shorter periods of time. Maybe you're setting up regular meetings with supervisors, whereas it was more on the fly in the past, although I think it's always a good idea for supervisors to regularly check in with those they supervise. And that make sure that you've really thought about intentionally what is that technology going to be for your members communicating throughout the day. And in your organization, it might be that you're using email for that. In some organizations, you might use Slack. In some organizations, they might use something like Microsoft Teams. I have to admit, at Maryland Nonprofits, we started this Microsoft Teams like one day before we all started to work remote, and I was completely skeptical, but we are using it quite often and with a lot of success. Would you agree with that, Patty?
It's fantastic, and I shared your cynicism. I thought it was just going to be another stream of email or texting, but it is just quick and simple and easy to keep us connected. So I honestly am hoping that folks on the program will share with us in the Q&A some of the ways that they have been engaging their teams. We have a weekly phone call with our staff, and we have Microsoft Teams available, but if you will share with us how you're keeping your teams engaged, that would be much appreciated.
And at the outset of that, we were even having daily phone calls, short daily phone calls, but we've eased off of daily, and now it's every couple of days. Okay, one of our participants says they're using Zoom calls and instant messaging. That's great.
Yeah.
Really great. You do a happy hour, or you use Zoom and do a virtual happy hour. That's great. We had to have a going away party this week for a staff member who was leaving us, and we even did a virtual scavenger hunt as part of that little staff going away party on Zoom. Have daily 9 o'clock staff calls. That's great. That's been a big hit. Weekly check-ins by Zoom, individual team meetings throughout the week. Microsoft Teams is what this individual uses, individual meetings, Microsoft Teams. Twice weekly Google Hangouts or Zoom meetings. Good. So we're grabbing onto the available technology and figuring out how to do that. We put this out to our member community a couple of weeks ago, and one of our members, associate member Liz McLean, from our associate member NoSank, which is mentioned this great article called Teams Can Work Remotely Without Feeling Remote. And I'll put that in the chat, so if you'd like to see it. But it advocates for this whole strategy around working out loud. And it gives a lot of ideas for how you can even if everyone's working remotely, you are really intentionally reaching out, narrating and sharing your work, building skills, letting other people observe your work, and fostering sort of online reputation and fostering online community. Got a couple more notes here. Social media encouragement sessions, that's great. Been able to, a morning call each morning to set priorities, text throughout the day. They use Dropbox to share files. And this individual said they've been doing a short morning and afternoon Google Meet, but now they've just moved it to just the afternoon meet, and they connect by chat throughout the day. Doing staff meetings by WebEx and a staff happy hour on Fridays. A themed event. Last week was institutional trivia. I love it. That's amazing, and that sounds terrific.
Yeah.
And also doing meditation by Facebook. These are some excellent ideas. Thanks for sharing those.
And maybe you all have noticed that, similar to what I have noticed, it has relaxed some of the relationships among our staff. There is a greater sense of familiarity and closeness, and maybe it's true that you know, hard times bring us together, but I'm so happy and pleased to see the many ways that you all are getting your teams together.
And I think another silver lining, Patty, is this idea that we have some people on our staff who are almost 100% remote, even in sort of regular times. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when you're doing a meeting that's in person and then you're bringing someone in through Zoom, they're not necessarily on the same footing, and people are forgetting that they're, you know, on the screen or on the conference call line, and that goes away when everyone is working remote.
Agreed.
There's another note in the chat that I love. It says that their staff has been doing, through Google Groups, they've been doing what they call bonding breaks, where they share special personal items on a topic, like what useless item do you have around your house? Like, that's terrific. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. So from the employer perspective, certainly you need to assess the technology what your needs are. What do you have in place? What do you need? And what kind of support do you need to give people with their information technology problems? Don't assume just because you know how to use Zoom really well that everyone does. I was on a call recently where someone was on Zoom and they had a ceiling fan above their head with the light on, and it was spinning the whole time. And I was able to talk with him and encourage him, you know, not to have the ceiling fan on during Zoom calls, because it could potentially make someone a little queasy to kind of watch that spinning movement and things like that. So giving people supports on even kind of things like that could be really helpful. And, you know, giving people advice on, you know, where do they ask questions? Like, how can we be in a position where we can, you know, do this other thing that we knew how to do really well in the office. Now that we're working remotely, how do we get that done? And then thinking about how are you protecting your passwords and your material. You might even need more protections now than you did in the past. So think about that. And then, you know, what are you doing to make sure that your client's information, your employees' information remains private in the way that it needs to be. So we think about all of that. And that's going to be different for each organization, depending on what you are doing yourselves, what your mission is, who you're serving. Okay. And so, of course, in the midst of COVID-19 and our current situation, we're moving from you know, what a benefit it is to be working remotely to, if you're going to be working, you must be working remotely because you're sort of barred from going to the office in many cases. And so someone mentioned before, can you require that people be on, you know, have their camera on? I think it's a good idea to have some expectations around that, certainly everyone would need to be able to hear one another and be heard. And you might have, one expectation is that, certain meetings a week, you hope that everyone will be on camera. But, to also show grace and patience to people as well. You don't necessarily know exactly what is going on in everyone's world right at this moment. And they might say, today I'm going to not be on camera. I've been in staff meetings where people have said, I'm going to turn my camera off because I'm eating a really messy lunch while we're in this meeting. And, we see that kinds of things as well. We know that some people in the midst of this current situation are having to change their work hours. They might be working a split schedule. They might be taking off random half hours throughout the day in order to take care of other responsibilities. And, sometimes you might say, we normally have this morning meeting at 9, but in the midst of all this, we're going to make the morning meeting at noon or something like that. And then also think about sort of digital equity items. When we were getting ready to move to remote work, we were, said we need to figure out if everyone has the setup to be able to do this, and to figure out if people have access to Wi-Fi, to different kinds of things that they might need to do their work. And then also some organizations, I know at our organization, we're making some special allowances and allowing people to be reimbursed for things like Wi-Fi and mobile service because of the fact that we're all needing to use that to do our work. Though in normal times, generally, we're not making those types of reimbursement. The Nonprofit's Guide to Remote Work gives some information about reimbursement of travel expenses. And so I'd encourage you to check that out later on. It describes some things about, what is your official work site, and it describes about reimbursement to travel beyond that official work site. So I'd encourage you to check that out. It's less relevant right now in the time of pandemic, but I would check it out because it may be relevant to you depending on where your employees are and the travel that they might need as part of their work.
So Amy, back on the previous slide, I would just add one thing, and it is responsive to a comment that one of our participants sent in a little bit earlier, that she feels like she's always at work in her home remote work setting. And a practical tip, which maybe we all could sit with and think about how to implement better, is how to create some barriers on work so that we don't feel that when we're in our homes, we're always at work. And I know that we have to be flexible and generous and gracious about permitting folks to work when they can, given the totality of their circumstances. So I know you, Amy, are working earlier in the day so that you can get some work done before the kids are up. And for me, it's easier to work a little bit later in the day. But so that we could also not always be at work, remember to take care of yourself and to create some time in your home when you're not working. That would be a practical tip that I would add. Just pay attention to the self-care piece.
And I would say that that's a important sort of idea or hack for working from home. Like, come up with the boundaries that you're going to place on your work. And you could, even mark in your calendar those hours that you won't be working. We have a little practice where we'll write like we're off duty at a specific time. And so people, if they're trying to find someone, they say, oh, well, they're off duty at the moment, but it looks like they're back in a half hour, so we'll be able to get back with them. Whether that's within the workday or whether that's kind of at the end of the person's work. We think about that as well. And communicating your availability, I think, is key as well. So let's talk about some of your hacks and some of your best ideas. I've got some additional ones I can mention, but for you as an employee in this current environment doing remote work, what are some of your best ideas that you'd like to share with those on the call today?
Brandon, I love this idea. Create daily schedules. It helps me create balance for myself. And I guess you just write it down on a piece of paper or on your computer so that you know what your day is going to look like, and maybe you tell yourself when your day is going to end. Great idea.
I think that we mentioned this before, but things like Slack or Microsoft Teams, that's really helpful in terms of an ability to kind of drop into somebody's workday and ask them a quick question in the same way that you might run down the hall and ask them a quick question. I feel like that's super helpful. And we're also using the features on that of phone calls and sharing screens and things like that. It's been really helpful. I've seen some pictures of folks who have actually taken tape and taped around their workspace, encouraging others in their homes to kind of respect the tape on the floor during times that they're working. Sort of interesting. We're getting comments like we're beginning to implement a timekeeping app to manage time and streamline remote work. That's terrific. We've been using online timekeeping for a while, and it's really terrific. Mm-hmm. We see that some people are taking breaks and getting outside to exercise and reset. That is terrific as well.
So important.
Using the previous commute time to plan their day. That's also really smart.
Thank you.
I miss my commute time a little bit. I probably shouldn't say that on a course on remote work, but here's a comment. I saw one coworker who had a disclaimer with her work hours and 2-hour segments with breaks. And I'm working from home due to COVID-19 with 2 toddlers and a puppy. Please excuse me if you hear a bark or cry during this time. I appreciate your patience. That is terrific as well. In fact, some people will say that at the beginning of meetings or webinars that they might be conducting. So we're thinking about that as well. Asking for sort of grace or patience. And it seems like people have been helpful with that. People are using their Outlook calendar a lot, and they're printing out their pages and prioritizing, keeping themselves on task. It's great as well. A lot of people really encourage using video chat to really have the opportunity to focus in when they're in meetings and conversations. Sharing agendas or what you want to accomplish during a conversation in advance to make that even more efficient. Some folks even lay out expectations for what the organization expects from folks when they're in the midst of a Zoom call, in terms of things like eating at another time, using the camera, not using the camera. Some folks will do a virtual icebreaker at the beginning of like a check-in Zoom call. Someone mentioned before, what's that useless item in your house? We've used things like one word to describe how you're feeling. I'm trying to think of some others, but kind of really simple check-in kinds of things, and giving yourself sort of 5 minutes at the beginning to do that and connect. Also to show up on time to those Zoom check-in meetings so that you have the chance for the sort of chit-chat at the beginning. Evaluating virtual meetings, that's also a must. And if you're doing follow-up, that the follow-up from those meetings, the notes are really helpful, things that people are actually going to read. So not necessarily minutes, but just the action steps. Setting up an absolute cutoff time for the day, and make sure coworkers are aware of that time. That is really a terrific idea. Anything else you want to add, Patty?
I think we're ready to move to the next slide, which is a little related.
Okay, great. And I want to mention one other quick comment that was made. Whoops, sorry about that. Our place of work has a policy that says no communication that requires an immediate response. We give at least 24 hours since we're all on different schedules, and it really helps empower those who need frequent breaks and need strong boundaries between work and home. It's a great practice. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, Patty, on to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amy. So I would really encourage you all to check out the article. You see the link at the bottom of this slide. It's about addressing some of the challenges of remote work, and it gives you some good examples. So overwork. You should just set some boundaries. We've heard those suggestions from a number of you, and create an alarm for the end of the workday. we got both of those suggestions from you. How to address isolation. Take advantage of social networking if you can. Request check-ins with staff members or colleagues. Communications. Find out what your supervisor's preferences are, face-to-face or audio-only calls. Interruptions. Surely it's more difficult when we're all working from home, but figure out how you're going to deal with it, even if it's just a simple comment of, oh, did you hear my son just slam his bedroom door? Sorry. Health, make sure you're walking around, getting up from your desk, moving around. More than ever, I think we need to be focused on our own health. So maybe you can go for a walk in your neighborhood or do a little exercise program. There are tons of online options just to go around with. Support your staff. You might have less ability to utilize support staff, but hopefully there's some accessibility of information technology staff so that you can be in touch. Childcare and lack of childcare, much more difficult in the current situation. I feel for parents of young children, and I applaud you all for keeping their schooling moving forward in these just really challenging times. Also, what are the additional costs to employees? And just do your best to be as clear as possible regarding what you'll cover for employees and what's covered by the employer. And different organizations are going to address this differently. So I think that clarity in these times is so important, and if expectations are clear, there will be much less disappointment.
And we'll just conclude with this slide. And I thought this was a great article, and the link to the article is below. But Lindsay Tiger wrote in this Fast Company article, while much of the news is scary, I found a silver thread, maybe not a silver lining, silver thread of hope in the pandemic. What if this is our chance to prove that remote work, well, works, and that there might be at the end of this more opportunities for people to take advantage of the benefits of working remote, because we've been sort of thrust into something that might feel like a big experiment on remote work without as much maybe preparation as maybe we might have hoped. So we're just about done, but if anyone has any final questions, now would be the best time. There's a comment here stating, and it's way better for the environment. That is true. Certainly something good to mention in the midst of Earth Day, this Earth Week that we're in the midst of. And with that, I think we can conclude our time together. I'm grateful for the chance to work with you again, Patty. Thank you for this time, and thank you for all of you for being part of today's program.
Always a pleasure, Amy, and thank you to all of those of you who dialed in today. I hope it has been helpful, and we are available to you. So on the screen, you can see our email addresses. We welcome your comments and your stories, and we wish you all well in these really challenging times.
All the best to all of you. Have a great afternoon.
You too. Take care.